Welcome to HFY Stories. Please subscribe to the channel. Your one click means the world to me. The armor had never been breached. 4 years, hundreds of matches, and Craig's plating had turned back everything the Academy's weapons could throw at it, until a blade came down and rang out like a struck bell, and 230 kilograms of thornback simply stopped moving. Instructor Vorak would replay that sound for weeks, trying to place why it frightened him more than blood would have. But that comes later. Understand first what led to it. Vorak had spent 17 cycles training the galaxy's fiercest species for war, and nothing had unsettled his cadets like the arrival of a single human lieutenant barely a meter and a half tall. Kira Mendes stood in the ring on her first day looking, by every metric his cadets respected, like something that belonged in a nursery rather than a combat academy. Crag, 2.8 meters of obsidian-plated muscle from the Thornback homeworld, said as much, loud enough for the whole yard to hear, that testing her insulted everyone's time. Humans, he said, were built for remembering facts, not for fighting. 46 other cadets, representing 22 more worlds, nodded along without a flicker of doubt. Kira didn't answer him. She reached back and drew a blade that had no place on a modern battlefield, 70 centimeters of curved, ancient-looking steel, its grip worn dark by generations of hands. Not a smart blade, not a training weapon. A family relic, cleared for the exam only because it carried no power source at all. Vilesh went first. The six-bodied Hydrian had never lost a match in her academy career, and she came at Kira from every angle at once. Vorak blinked, and by the time his eyes caught up, 3 of Vilesh's bodies were unconscious on the floor, and Kira was already sheathing her weapon. 1 second, maybe 2. Vilesh had telegraphed the strike. Kira explained afterward, calm as still water, the same clockwise coil every time. Once you saw the pattern, evading it was arithmetic. Tormax fell next, his faint red, and countered before his own hands had finished committing to it. He hit the floor like a wall coming down, and asked from the ground how anyone could have known. Then Craig stepped in. He didn't rush her. He walked, deliberate, trusting the reach and plating that had never once failed him. Kira didn't circle. She closed the distance herself, which should have been suicide against a thornback, and struck his chest 3 times in half as many seconds. Each impact rang out at a pitch the armor couldn't hold, and each ring carried straight through the plate into the nerves beneath it. His knees went on the 3rd strike. He hit the ground, still trying to understand what had happened to him. Metal has a pitch it can't survive, Kira told him, sheathing the blade. Find it, and you don't need to go through the wall at all. Nobody in the arena spoke for a long moment. Then, one by one, the cadets backed away from her, not in challenge, but the way prey backs away from something it has only just recognized as a predator. Vorak dismissed the class and sat alone with the footage afterward, understanding he'd watched something far larger than an exam. That understanding sharpened 3 mornings later in an almost empty commissary, where he found Kira alone with her back to the wall and a clear line to every exit, an old habit, apparently, for a species that had never stopped needing one. Her classmates, he'd heard, were still avoiding her. One had reportedly wedged himself into a ventilation duct rather than pass her in a corridor. He sat across from her and asked, as gently as he knew how, what kind of childhood produced someone who could do that to Craig without visibly trying. She turned her cup once before answering. "You've read the file on my planet," she said. "Temperate, oxygen-rich, garden world rating. That's the geology instructor. Here's what the file leaves out." She set the cup down hard enough that the liquid jumped. "Earth doesn't host predators. Earth is one." She counted it on her fingers, plagues that had halved whole populations, ice ages that buried continents, eruptions that blacked out the sun for years at a stretch, and that was only the planet doing it to itself. Then there was what her own kind had done to each other on top of it, splitting into camps over land, language, belief, sometimes nothing at all, and building steadily better tools to end one another with. 50,000 years of it, by the oldest evidence, and the peace they were so proud of, 80 unbroken years, their longest ever, was still young enough that a single bad decade could undo it. "I'm not exceptional," she said, and there was no false modesty in it, no performance at all. "I'm a woman who took her training seriously. There are billions like me at home who never had to be tested." He told her then what he'd come to tell her, that the council had convened that same night, that there was talk of restricting human enrollment, of monitoring humans on base, of whether a species carrying instincts that deep could be trusted this close to coalition weapons. Something moved behind her eyes, but her voice didn't break. "Then tell them," she said, standing, "that we didn't choose the world that made us this way. We're trying to spend what it gave us on something better than conquest." She lifted her tray. "We've been called primitive before, usually right before we proved someone wrong." She walked out and left him with the last of her cold coffee and a report he still didn't know how to write. He didn't have to write it alone. By midday his office had filled, Craig first, still favouring the side she'd struck, then Vilesh, Tormax, and 24 more who 3 days earlier would have crossed the yard to avoid this exact room. They hadn't come to demand her removal. They'd come to ask her to teach them. "We trained for tradition," Craig admitted. "She trains like her life depends on it, because for her people it always has." Vorak carried that to the council instead of a recommendation for restraint, and the council, reluctantly, then not so reluctantly, agreed. Human doctrine went into the curriculum that same cycle. Cadets who had once fled a corridor rather than pass her began asking Kira to correct their footwork between drills. Months later, at the closing ceremony, Kira graduated at the top of her class. Craig took second and stood before the full assembly to give her something his own hands had shaped, an honor blade of compressed diamond, its edge engraved in galactic standard and in characters he'd spent weeks learning to copy correctly. He read the inscription himself, voice rough with an accent still finding its shape, from the one who believed himself finished learning to the one who taught him he had barely begun. Kira's eyes filled, and she let them, right there in front of 40 species who were only now starting to understand what that meant on her world, not surrender, but its opposite. Vorak watched her weigh the new blade in one palm and the old one, still sheathed at her hip, in the other, one relic beside another, 80 years and 50,000 resting side by side. She pressed the diamond flat against Craig's plated knuckles, the same way he'd seen her rest a hand on the ancient hilt 100 times in the training hall, and inclined her head to him, not low, not submissive, just enough. He filed his final report that night. It ran shorter than the council expected, and he changed only one line before sending it, that a species which had survived 50,000 years of teaching its children to fight had also, somehow, taught them exactly when to stop. Everything else, he decided, they could see for themselves. Through the wide viewport behind her, the twin suns of Kepler 9 caught the diamond edge and threw it, for one bright second, across every face still watching.